Hello, and welcome to our vlog about the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution and the French Revolution are very similar in the fact that they both follow the model of the revolution. The motto of the revolution is a guide that most revolutions follow. They start off with the old regime, where there is an absolute dictatorship, an oppressive government, and there is a high level of discontent in society. The next stage is the modern stage, where changes slowly begin, although these changes are too slow for some. Next comes the radical stage, where there are huge levels of change in a short, usually violent period of time. Fourth is the return to moderate, where the people realize that both the old regime and the radical stage weren't working out, so they go in between and back to moderate levels. Finally, a dictator comes around and takes control because once again there is a weak government. Hence we go back to the absolute rule and the beginning of this model of a revolution.
Okay, in the Russian Revolution, there was a monarchy during the old regime. The Romanov dynasty was in charge. There was Alexander II, who made many reforms like the emancipation of serfs, as well as the making of roads, schools, and improved healthcare. But he was eventually assassinated on the fourth attempt, largely because his reforms were much too slow. Next up was Alexander III, who implemented pogroms, which is blaming ethnic groups like Jews. He also had strict censorship codes that kept a lid on society, and then there was also the secret police. The form of government at this time was autocracy, and then in 1894 Nicholas II inherited the throne from his father and continued the autocracy. But at this time there were countless problems with the industrialization, including horrible working conditions, low wages, and child labor. Now this might all be familiar because the French Revolution was highly similar to this, as they had identical problems with industrial growth. Eventually this helped fuel revolutionary movements, and with the Communist Manifesto guiding them, two groups were formed, the more radical Bolsheviks and the more moderate Mensheviks. More discontent was created when Russia was humiliated in the Russo-Japanese War, and this led to Bloody Sunday, where over 1,000 were wounded and several hundred were killed. This forced Nicholas II to promise more freedom with the creation of Russia's first parliament, the Duma, but eventually he just dissolved it because he wanted to have all the power. On top of it all, Nicholas decided to join World War I, and Russia just could not handle it. The Tsar decided to move his headquarters to the war front because of his heavy losses, and this let Rasputin, a self-proclaimed holy man, gain power through Tsarina Alexandra. More problems arose, those along the lines of supply shortages, and the problems were unsolvable. Soldiers mutinied, inflation rose, and it eventually led to the March Revolution, which began the moderate stage.
With all these problems in Russia, it was not very long until the people revolted. In March of 1917, the March Revolution begins. The leaders of the March Revolution were mainly women, textile workers that could not afford to feed and take care of their families. At first, soldiers obeyed orders to fight against the riots, but soon they joined in with the revolution. As these riots increased, Nicholas II was forced to step down from his throne. After about 3 centuries, the Tsarist rule was now over. With no leader in Russia, the leaders of the Duma quickly established a provisional government with Alexander Kerensky as the leader. This is very similar to the French Revolution because the provisional government is a lot like the National Assembly. Alexander Kerensky, once in power, made the bad decision of staying in World War II. With the war in Germany, conditions in Russia grew even worse and people grew very radical. Socialist reformists decided that forming Soviets, small local councils formed of workers, would be a good way to combat the growing problems. In some of these cities, Soviets had even more power than the provisional government. With all these problems growing, forming, and increasing in Russia, Lenin, the major leader of the Bolsheviks who had been exiled, returned to Russia to begin the radical revolution.
The next stage was the radical stage, and it too had several similarities as the radical stage of the French Revolution. The Bolsheviks were the parallel of the Jacobins, and once again there was excessive violence. The Germans had arranged for Lenin to return to Russia, and they helped fund him to raise an army and take over the temporary government. This was all in the goal of having Russia sign a treaty with Germany. Lenin and the Bolsheviks gained control of several Soviets around Russia, and by the fall of 1917, people in the cities were rallying to the call of Lenin, the promise of peace, land, and bread. In November, armed factory workers launched a surprise assault on the Winter Palace and arrested the provisional government. Lenin distributed farmland and then signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. Conditions included putting Russia out of World War I, and huge concessions were made to Germany, including the handing over of population, farmland, railways, resources, and money. Once again, the Russian society felt humiliated with the terms of the treaty, and they objected to the Bolshevik rule. This then led to the bloodiest part of the Russian Revolution, the Russian Civil War. It was red versus white, red being the Bolsheviks headed by the excellent Leon Trotsky. White was made up of several different groups fighting for different aims, and even included Western nations. In the end, the Red Army crushed all opposition, but with the death of around 14 million Russians. Now the economy was in ruin, and something had to be done. With the war having destroyed the Russian economy, trade was non-existent, production had dropped, workers had fled, Lenin turned his attention to reviving the economy and reconstructing the government. Lenin resorted to a small-scale version of capitalism in March 1921 called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Changes included allowing peasants to sell surplus instead of turning it into the government, and major industry, transport, banking, and international trade was kept under government control. However, small factories, businesses, farms were under private ownership. Foreign investment was also encouraged. Finally, due to the new policies and the renewed peace, the Russian economy slowly recovered. Consequently, by 1928, Russian farms and factories were producing as much as they were before World War I. Economic reforms weren't the only reforms made, there were also political ones. Lenin organized Russia into several self-governing republics under the central government and named the country the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. The Bolsheviks were renamed the Communist Party from the writings of Karl Marx, and a new constitution was drafted, supposedly based on socialist and democratic principles. However, it was a dictatorship of the Communist Party in reality.
The return to absolutism stage occurs in 1922 when Lenin dies from a stroke. With the head of the Communist Party dead, Stalin, a rough, crude man, climbs the Communist Party and becomes the leader. Stalin is basically the Napoleon of the Russian Revolution. Once Stalin is in power, he begins to turn Russia into a totalitarian state. This means that the government would have complete control over everything. The way the government controlled the people was with the secret police. The secret police were a group of police that had complete access to everyone's lives through wiretaps, spies, and whatever you can think of. Then, over the course of Stalin's rule, the secret police arrested and executed millions of so-called traitors to the Communist Party. Some members of the Communist Party began to not like what Stalin was doing under the Communist Party name. So, in 1934, Stalin launched the Great Purge, in which he eliminated all opposition to his power. Historians estimate that he killed more than 8 million people during the Great Purge. This led to Stalin having complete control, and no one would be able to oppose him. Another way Stalin controlled people, besides the secret police, was through propaganda and censorship. Everything the media said or did had to go through the Communist Party. Not only was the media controlled by Stalin, but what the kids learned was controlled. Kids only learned what the government wanted to them learn, and teachers reported on kids that could become revolutionaries when they grow up. As soon as Stalin had gained complete control over the society, he began to make 5-year plans. 5-year plans set impossible to reach goals to help push the economy forward. The method of pushing the economy forward was very successful, and soon Russia had become completely industrialized. In 1928, to help fuel the five-year plan, Stalin created collective farms. These were farms where hundreds of families worked together for very little pay. This was successful because by 1938, more than 90% of the peasants lived on collective farms. The only people that really had their life improved under Stalin were the women. During the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the Bolsheviks claimed that men and women were equal. They continued on with this philosophy, and then, while Stalin was in charge, this turned out to be a good thing, because women liked the fact that they could now get jobs and were even with men. By 1950, 75% of the doctors were women. Towards the end of the 1930s, Stalin had achieved complete control of the USSR, and no one would be able to stop him.